Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is...
Until the End of Crime.
Do we want to do the follow us thing at the top? Okay.
Do you want to take
follow
it away?
us? Welcome, hopefully back. But if not, just welcome to another episode of Until the End of Crime with Cameron and Hayden. You go.
Yes, besties, we're so glad to have you back in the room with us. I hope you feel like you're nestled up close, listening fireside to this engaging conversation about crime. If you're not following us already, much like Cameron said, please find us on Instagram, End of Crime Pod. You can send us an email. We do get emails sometimes, which always surprises me. But sometimes we do get other contact that's important, people who've reached out to ask us to cover a certain case, which is what we're doing today. Shout out, Rebecca. Thank you so much for this wonderful suggestion that I have grappled with for weeks on months, trying to figure out how to tell the story. And I think we finally got there. I think we finally made it.
I hope you're still here, Rebecca. We haven't heard from you in a while. Reach out.
I just chatted with her yesterday.
Oh.
On Instagram. So, hey, Beck.
Why was I not getting the notifications?
Oh, I was messaging her from my personal account.
Oh.
Yes. I think we follow each other's personal Instagrams, which I don't know if she wants me to say that out loud, but I don't guess she would care.
I think we do as well.
Yeah. So, which if you want to be my friend personally on Instagram, that's mostly fine too. Feel free to follow us, but really check out End of Crime Pod.
Yeah. I'm a little bit more hesitant to accept follows from people I don't know.
As well you should be. But like we just had a conversation earlier today. It is different for women than men.
Yeah. Is that all you want to share?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so. At least for now. Maybe next week we can record something different.
Oh, God.
Oh, well, no, my window will be fixed by the time this comes out.
Yeah.
So my husband and I went on kind of a weekend trip for a friend's wedding.
Yeah.
Shout
a
out
wedding
Hannah
retreat.
and Noah. Beautiful.
Congratulations.
And the most incredible wedding. I can't say enough about the wedding. It was truly what I think every wedding should be. There was no dancing at the reception. It was trivia. It was a Mamma Mia sing-along. It was board games. There was a bonfire on the first night. Beautiful. It tins across the boards. Amazing. So great job there. And Andrew and I were at the wedding, or at the wedding, pre-wedding ceremony activities on Friday evening. And my little cousin Bryce had volunteered I asked him to watch our dog while we were gone, and he agreed. And we had left a spare key hidden for him on our back porch. And ultimately, it was probably 8 p.m, well into the bonfire, and we got a text with him asking, hey, am I turning the key wrong? What am I doing? To which my husband panicked, and I was very calm, very go with the flow, very zen. And I said, hey. Well, and Andrew was the one who was like, no, I locked the deadbolts. He can't get in. There's no way for him to get in. Meanwhile, we're 2 hours away from our home. And so I give what I think is the best directive possible.
I don't even know at what point this would cross my radar, but go ahead.
In a brilliant suggestion, I told my cousin very calmly, just break the window. There's a window in the door. Just break it. Let yourself in. It's fine. We're 2 hours away. A locksmith can't help us. Go ahead and break in.
Yeah, it's got like the wooden strips.
Like the wooden lattice. There were panes, like individual window panes, 9 of them, a 3x3 grid. And in my mind, Bryce was going to be breaking...
No, in your mind, there were 9 individual window panes.
Yes. That is what I believed. And so I said, just break it out and let yourself in. Well, both my husband and Bryce found this difficult to swallow. They were not vibing with this solution. And again, I just very calmly said, no big deal. Break the window. It's fine. Ultimately, after fiddling around with a knife and then a trellis, I finally tell Bryce, just fucking throw the big rock at it. Just break in. Just get in there. And he did. And when he did it, he was, oh shit. And ends up just the whole window is shattered. All of the little individual panes were not individual panes. It was one big window. And anyway, he got in, was able to take care of our dog. And then I had a Walmart order delivered to him these big cardboard pieces and some Gorilla Tape so that he was able to tape up the big hole in the door so that he could sleep soundly and securely.
I reacted similarly to Andrew and Bryce when you said that. And yet, now that you were just retelling me that story, I have thought about when I was, like, in this house specifically, what I would do if I had somehow gotten locked out, or it's difficult to explain really because I think I had a bit of a panic moment when I got home the other day because I had a new dog walker come and walk my dogs when I had to work until 7 or 8 the other night because my dog walker, who I've been using since I moved here, moved to Birmingham.
Birmingham?
Exactly.
Is that how they say it?
Yes. When I got home, the first thing I noticed was that my gate was not locked. So the gate to my property is basically my front door.
Uh-huh.
And I don't always remember to lock the back door when I leave in the mornings because I lock the gate to the property so nobody can get to my front door, let alone my back door, because the gate is locked. So of course that was a day that I did not lock the back door, which I remembered once I saw that the gate was unlocked. Anyway, I came inside, checked the house. It was fine, but I was like, what would I do if, like, the door was locked? Like, if somebody had come in and they had put the chain over and I could not get the door open, and the back door was locked. And I thought, well, I would just break the window pane to the back door. Like, I would just break the glass on the... So I guess I get getting to that place.
So you agree it's a good idea.
But I will say this. I'm probably a little bit too... Like, there's just no world in which I can't open the front door. At that rate, the most logical thing to do would be to open the door and to break the chain that is holding the door closed. Because there is no deadbolt. Or what if something happens when I'm on my way to the States and my dog walker, like, has some sort of accident and can't get there? Like, what do I do? I was like, I need to give my uncle a set of keys, or I guess just tell him to go break the window to get to the dogs. But I don't know. That was such a hypothetical for me. And because it was like a real life situation for you, that did not feel like the right answer.
In my head, it was clear as day. I was like, this is fine. This is brilliant. I can't drive 2 hours back home. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to celebrate my friend.
All of that to say, it was not 9 individual panes.
No, it was not. It was one gigantic pane. And so now we just have this cute lattice work over a hole in our door.
And then a chair just propped up underneath as if you can't reach right in and move it.
We did upgrade to a Brinks door thing, so we've got that right now. And of course, I have been a little fearful at night. I'm like, this is crazy. This is a huge hole in our door. And you know what? I said, I'll just lock my bedroom door on top of that. And so...
Moreover, I'm concerned about the cockroaches coming in.
Oh, why do you even bring that up?
Because I hate cockroaches. Hayden, they don't have cockroaches like that here. And I still sometimes, like when I just made tea, I was like, I should have checked the teapot before I put it on to boil because there was probably a cockroach in there. Like, I hate those things. I hate them. I am so terrified of them. Do you know why?
Because you ate one as a child?
No, worse. When I was in 3rd grade, I was getting ready to go to school, and I went in to do a little tinkle in the pot. And when I went to pull my shorts back up, right where I put my hand, instead of just grabbing shorts, I grabbed a cockroach. I'm still not over it. That's fine.
Clearly.
Would you be?
I don't want to get into my experience with cockroaches.
Oh, God.
They are disgusting. They are awful. Thank God we don't have any. But they don't do me in quite like they do you in. I'm not physically shuddering from the utterance cockroach.
Oh, God. Yeah.
So,
No, I don't. Oh.
Wow, I don't have a question for you. I forgot.
So make sure that you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram and following us on any platform where we have audio or videos posted. I mean, YouTube. There's no video of us, but it's an audio that has our logo in the background for the video. One day there will be videos of us. I just have to really up my editing game because there's a lot that ends up on the cutting room floor in these parts.
And we'd have to figure out a software that allows you to video and audio edit. So, which I'm sure that exists. Also, I could volunteer to do part of that, but I don't. We could just get the recording perfect the first time around.
Yeah. Well, once we do that, once that becomes the norm or something that we master once, then we'll do video.
Ups, no digressions, no talking about things we can't air.
So not this episode, because you've already missed some stuff.
A level of self-control I don't possess.
We would have to be medicated, both of us.
So Cameron, have you ever been exposed to the elements? Has your life ever been in danger from exposure?
I was like, yeah, I stepped outside today. Has my life been in danger due to elemental exposure? My dear Watson. No, probably not. I'm not.
Well, I think about when you were in France during the heat wave. You could have had a heat stroke.
People did. People did have a heat stroke. They did die. We were handling it better than a lot of the people that we were around because we were from Texas. And so it was 95 degrees. But as I was rudely reminded when I moved here, air conditioning isn't really standard in other parts of the world and in some states, I think, which is wild to even think about. But like, okay, this week I looked at the forecast in Texas, and tomorrow the high is like in some parts where my mom is, I want to say the high is going to be in the 40s Fahrenheit. And then by the end of the week, the high is going to be in around the 90s.
Ugh.
And so I'm like, it's not possible to not have air conditioning when in March is when it starts pitching up to the 90s and it stays there or higher until November.
Yeah. And then even sometimes into November.
I said November.
Yeah.
And you said into November.
Yes.
We both said November.
Well, I know, but I felt like yours sounded like, okay, November 1, it never gets into 90 again.
No, it still
know.
will. I mean, sometimes Christmas, it's still
in the 80s.
Hot.
Maybe even. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it gets more.
Doesn't feel like it cools off until January.
The very end of January, maybe the beginning of February. You get it for about 3 to 5 business days, and then it heads back out.
Then it's goodbye. Yeah.
Whereas yesterday, I was like, oh, there's water droplets on the window pane. It must be raining. I opened the door, and it was snowing. And I was like, hello? What?
Okay. So no near brushes with illness from heat exposure. What about cold exposure?
No, but that's only because when the snowpocalypse hit Texas in 2021, I only lost power for maybe 4 or 5 hours.
Okay.
But otherwise, I mean, I know that there were students at the school that I was at the time who didn't have power for a couple weeks. And
just during like snowpocalypse in Texas, people did die
from
exposure. Okay.
My dad would have, because he didn't have power and he lived in a house that it's probably 125 years old and it's not insulated or anything. And because he's quadriplegic, in order to prevent himself from getting pressure sores, he had a water bed and it started to freeze.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, there you go. Okay. That was uniquely sad.
He didn't.
Jesus Christ. Well, today's story deals with exposure to the elements. None related to a water bed, but close.
It's just such a unique experience, right? That like the bed beneath you would freeze and that would be what would cause you? Because, anyway, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. That is incredibly unique. I am both glad and distraught that you shared it with me today.
Well.
Okay. I don't even know what to do next. I don't know how to leave that conversation.
Go into your case.
I don't know how to depart.
What do you mean?
It has me so fucked up. Okay. On the night of January 28th, 2000, the temperature on the outskirts of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan dropped to somewhere between -20 and -25 degrees Celsius. Roughly 5 to 13 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit.
Thank you.
The air at that temperature does not simply bite at exposed skin. It seizes it. It burns. The moisture in a person's nostrils freezes with each breath. Wind sweeps across the flat open expanse of the Canadian prairie, carrying nothing to slow it down. No buildings, no fences, no trees, just the vast and indifferent darkness of a Saskatchewan winter night.
Are you basically about to tell me about the Devil's Highway except for the frozen version?
Maybe, if I knew what the Devil's Highway was.
The Devil's Highway it's where Mexican nationals cross over into the United States unofficially. Sorry. I forgot to issue my apology. I would formally like to apologize to the person who commented on one of our YouTube videos saying that we claim to not be political, because I don't know what I could have said or done that would have given anybody that impression, but that's never been a platform that I have stood on. So,
yeah, I don't think anyone ever claimed that we were apolitical. I think we try to do a fair and kind job of not issuing judgments on people, on listeners. But I can tell you right now, I've never been more excited to get out and vote for a Democratic nominee for Texas Senate. Well, for United States Senate, but based in Texas. I can't wait to vote for James Tallarico. And so this podcast may not be a political podcast, but the people that run it are people who do have strong moral and ethical beliefs. And that does guide our political opinions. And so No, I was going to say it informs our storytelling. It informs the stories that matter to us. You know, there's a reason why we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's a reason why we do Weird Stories. There's a reason why we look at the different types of societal pressures and norms that both encourage and allow some of these dastardly crimes.
We tone it down some, and I do edit some things out when we listen back, and there are some things that we don't want to necessarily be published in our episodes, which does kind of inform a little bit the difficulty that I would have in editing video for us, because it's easy to snip just the audio, but I don't know how to do all of the things. It informs so much of what we do here, and so do we overtly sit here and say, insert political conversation? Not necessarily, but I would not claim that we are not political, that we are claiming to be not political. So
I think the best way to say it is that we do our best to not be inflammatory. We're not looking to cause discomfort or frustration, but we're still going to express what we believe in the work that we do. And I feel like it's pretty self-evident. And so to anyone who doesn't vibe with that, there's a really easy way to not have to deal with it. You stop listening.
Yeah.
So I don't need your listens that bad.
I think it's fair to say that I struggle a little bit more than Hayden does with the not being inflammatory, but we get by.
We make do.
So anyway, yeah, it's where people are crossing the border, the Mexican border, into the United States, and they're going in a way where it is uninhabitable, being...
Also, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, and not to be the typical white male interrupting a woman while she's speaking, but our very existence is political. Mm-hmm. I am a queer person. You are a woman. People get to legislate our lives and try to legislate our lives every day. And so, of course, this is political. crime is political.
Mhm.
So there is no escaping it. That's just so fucking asinine. Not to go to a place that's disparaging, but good God, what do you expect?
It's right. I mean, most of the victims that we cover are going to be women because, as I said earlier before we started recording, we are the prey.
Right. So fucking stick that in your pipe and smoke it, bitch. Of course it's political.
Welcome to our political obesity podcast.
Welcome to this radical leftist obesity praising podcast.
Have we ever explained obesity podcast? I don't think so. I think I've edited out whenever we've mentioned it before.
Oh, I don't want to go
we don't
there.
have explanation. Well, then it'll be edited out. It's fine.
Sorry. Maybe that's one of the stories we tell at the start of next episode. And that can be you telling a story.
Everybody who's interested in hearing the story, please DM us on Instagram. Devil's Highway. Basically, it's tough out there. They have like a jug of water that they take with them, and pretty quickly the water is gone, and so they end up having to be resourceful and reusing the water that they already drank to have something to drink.
Does that mean they're drinking their own urine?
It does. And there was a line in a book that I had to read. All freshmen at UT Austin had to read The Devil's Highway. And there was a line in it that Marilyn and I will still quote to each other that says, because they're talking about urinating into their bottle and like not everything makes it in. And so it's less wasteful
to be in others' mouths.
Yes, it says if you're really lucky, someone will piss in your mouth or something like that.
Okay, I'm so sorry I'm laughing. This is tragic. It is
and people die.
Very sad and tragic. Urine is not sterile. But that is also hard to not laugh at a little bit because there are people that do that for sexual gratification.
Yeah.
And it feels so taboo. But it does show the dehumanizing links that people have to go to in search of a better life, and their better life is coming here where they're going to be met with transgressions and judgment and probably ultimately deportation.
If they survive.
Okay. Again, welcome back to our political podcast. So sure, maybe it's kind of the inverse of that. At these temperature, the human body begins losing heat faster than it can produce within minutes. Exposed skin develops frostbite in less than half an hour. Core body temperature drops, shivering becomes violent, and then it stops altogether as the body's energy reserves are exhausted. Confusion sets in, coordination fails, and in the final stages of severe hypothermia, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing can occur. The dying person, their thermoregulatory system collapsing, begins removing their own clothing, convinced they are burning up, and then cardiac arrest. This isn't an abstraction. This is the Saskatchewan prairie in January. This is what the cold does to a human being who is dressed for a living room and not a frozen field. Darrell Night was a 33-year-old member of the Saulteaux First Nation. He'd been drinking that evening, left a friend's apartment, maybe got a little loud in the hallway of the building. He was wearing a t-shirt, a pair of jeans, a light denim jacket, and running shoes. No hat, no gloves. And then two officers from the Saskatoon Police Service, Constables Dan Hatchin and Ken Munson, picked him up. Knight expected a trip to the drunk tank, but instead the officers drove him roughly 5 kilometers outside of the city limits and shoved him out of the back seat of their cruiser near the Queen Elizabeth Power Station, which is a big kind of hulking industrial structure on the edge of the South Saskatchewan River, miles from the nearest residence. Knight shouted at the officers as they prepared to leave. He told them, "I will freeze to death." One of the offers, Hatchin, reportedly responded with something to the effect of, "That's your fucking problem." And then the cruiser pulled away, its taillights shrinking into the darkness until they were gone. Fortunately, Darrell Night did know this area. He had heard stories, whispered in kitchens and living rooms across Saskatoon's Indigenous community for years. Stories about police picking up First Nations men at night, driving them to the edges of the city, dropping them off in the cold, and then letting them walk back, if they could. The practice had a name, several names in fact, but most commonly it was known as a Starlight Tour, and Darrell Night was now on one. Something in him refused to give up. Darrell began walking. He recognized where he was, he knew the power station was close, and he found the building and began hammering on the door. No one came, but Darrell continued to pound for roughly 30 minutes, his fist against industrial steel in the freezing dark, his body losing heat with every passing second. Finally, a security guard did hear the noise and opened the door. Night was let in, he called a cab, and fortunately made it home. Darrell Night would later say he thought he was dead that night. He said that every rumor he had ever heard about the Starlight Tours came rushing back to him in that field. The officers never apologized, and Night would eventually leave Saskatoon entirely and never return. But here's what matters most about that night. Darrell Night survived, and in doing so, became the first person to prove, in a way that the public and the courts could no longer dismiss, what Indigenous communities in Saskatoon had known for decades. The police were taking people and leaving them to die. The environment itself had become the weapon. By using the Saskatchewan winter as their instrument of execution, officers avoided the forensic markers that would point definitively to homicide. No bullet wounds, no blunt force trauma, no ligature marks. Just a frozen body and a coroner's report reading probable hypothermia. The cold did the killing. The officers simply delivered the victim to it.
I doubt it, because cop cars, no. I guess I don't know about the CRMP, but what they've got stamped along the horses. But they all say protect and serve, right? That's what they're doing? Protecting and serving?
Cameron, remember, this isn't a political podcast.
I know. That's...
You know, I don't know what was on the side of the Saskatoon Police Service's cruisers in 2000, but I have to imagine part of their mission was to, I don't know, protect and serve the people of Saskatoon. Not drive them into the winter elements and leave them to die.
You think maybe they were not giving that treatment to the white people?
Doesn't sound like it.
Weird.
I don't want to make any assumptions, but I did not find that in any of my research. I know you're shocked.
I am. They also probably weren't driving women anywhere. Secluded, asking for favors in exchange to be released, or lighter sentences, or so on or so forth.
God, colonizer's gonna colonize, you know?
Yeah, that's Taylor Swift, right?
Her new hit single, Colonizer's Gonna Colonize. As she, never mind, don't let me enrage the Swifties. And I say that as someone who loves Taylor Swift.
You love Taylor Swift.
I do love Taylor Swift.
Billionaire. Eat the rich. I did it.
Within days of Darrell Night's survival, 2 frozen bodies would be discovered in the same stretch of industrial prairie where he had been abandoned. Both were Indigenous men, both were found wearing inadequate clothing, and their deaths, combined with Knight's account, would crack open a scandal that reached back at least a decade, to a 17-year-old boy named Neil Stonechild, found frozen and face down in a field in November of 1990, one shoe missing, blood on his face, and marks on his wrist consistent with handcuffs. The Saskatoon Police Service had closed that investigation in 3 days. This is the story of the Starlight Tours. To understand what happened in Saskatoon, you have to understand the place itself. Saskatoon sits almost dead center in the province of Saskatchewan, a city of roughly 200,000 people, bisected by the South Saskatchewan River. It's also a university town and a farming hub. It's a place where the winters are long and merciless, where average January lows hover around negative 20 degrees Celsius, with extreme drops plunging well below negative 33. The prairie stretches out flat in every direction, and the city's edges dissolve abruptly into open fields, industrial lots, and river bottomland. There is no kind of gradual suburban fade. One moment you're in the city, the next you're not. And in January, that boundary is the difference between survival and death. Saskatoon also has a significant Indigenous population. First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people make up a substantial percentage of the city's residents, and the broader province of Saskatchewan is home to dozens of First Nations and tribal councils. The relationship between these communities and the institutions that govern them, such as the police, the courts, the child welfare system, have been shaped by more than a century of colonial policy. Residential schools, forced relocation, the 60s scoop, which I do think that we discussed previously at some point. They aren't abstract historical references in Saskatchewan. They are part of the living memory, the blueprint of how the city of Saskatchewan works.
Should we quickly recap the scoop for anybody who hasn't listened to every episode? If I'm not mistaken, that was when Indigenous children were basically forced to go to schools to formally whitewash them, right?
Yes. Taken from their Indigenous families and given to white families.
Yeah.
So, to be a little more official, the 60s scoop refers to a dark period in Canadian history, roughly from the late 1950s to the 1980s, where child welfare authorities systematically apprehended thousands of Indigenous, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children from their families and community. Ultimately, they would be placed into child welfare systems and adopted primarily by non-Indigenous white middle-class families in Canada, the United States, and sometimes even Europe. The term was coined by researcher Patrick Johnston in his 1983 report. Estimates say that over 20,000 Indigenous children were removed from their Indigenous homes in this period, stripping them of their identity, language, and connection to their heritage. Also, many of the adoptive parents were never briefed or provided with information on the children's background, and some were even told their children were of European descent. There was no consent. Oh, God, this pains me. Social workers often removed children without notifying parents or band councils, a practice that was legal in many provinces at the time. And again, shout out to my people. Social workers often interpreted the socioeconomic conditions caused by colonization, such as poverty and poor housing, as neglect and would use that as a reason to remove children from the home. And that is the 60s scoop.
It's interesting because taking people, stripping them of their culture, hello, slave trade. But I don't know that was, I don't know how that was marketed because it was a couple years before my time. But it's interesting that the way that this is framed is that it's for their benefit.
Absolutely.
I don't think that you can talk about owning people in order to have laborers do everything for you, if that could be framed to be beneficial to them. But this is interesting because it's just taking children in order to make their lives better.
Yeah. Within this context, the Saskatoon Police Service operated as the primary law enforcement body for the city, and with Indigenous communities, there existed a deep and long-standing distrust of that force, rightfully so, a distrust, as it turns out, that was grounded in something far more concrete than what the generalized suspicion had been. The mechanics were straightforward. Officers would encounter an Indigenous person, usually a man, usually one who had been drinking or who was perceived to be causing a disturbance, and rather than booking them, arresting them, or even issuing a warning, the officers would place the individual in the back of a cruiser, drive them to the outskirts, order the person out of the vehicle, and leave. In the middle of winter, again often without adequate clothing, often miles from shelter. I want to make sure that everyone understands that this practice actually was stripped of euphemism. It was not a misguided method of sobering someone up, not an alternative to paperwork, but a deliberate placement of a human being into an environment where survival was statistically unlikely. The first documented case of a Starlight Tour traces back to May 22nd, 1976. On that night, Constable Ken King of the Saskatoon Police Service picked up 3 First Nations individuals, 2 men and 1 woman who was 8 months pregnant, and drove them to a remote area outside the city limits. He abandoned them there. All 3 survived. The Saskatoon police chief posted an internal memo about the incident, noting that instead of charging the individuals with having liquor in a place other than a dwelling, the officer had forced them into a vehicle and driven them to a remote area, leaving them to walk back. King was found guilty of discreditable conduct and neglect of duty. His punishment was a fine equivalent to 1 week's pay, or roughly $200. No criminal charges, no termination, no meaningful consequences. That was 1976, and the practice did not stop.
Charges for attempted murder?
Nope.
For attempted triple homicide?
quadruple if we want to get real pro-life about it.
Not so political.
Sorry.
I forgot she was pregnant.
She was 8 months pregnant. Really, that is a quadruple homicide.
Yeah.
8 months is crazy. That's like, obviously, we don't abort 8 months, right? Like, that's bananas. So, anyway.
Hey, her body, her choice.
No. No. Mm-mm. Nope.
That's a joke.
Usually I'm right there with you.
No. It was a joke because we're always claiming to not be political.
We're such radical leftists.
We're always claiming that we're not, and we just fail so hard.
Neil Christopher Stonechild was born on August 24th, 1973 in Brandon, Manitoba. He was Saulteaux First Nations, a member of one of the Anishinaabe peoples of the Northern Plains. His mother, Stella Bignell, was a single parent raising 5 children: Dean, Erica, Marcel, Neil, and Jason. The eldest, Dean, had been given up for adoption at a young age. Stella moved the family to Saskatoon in 1980 looking for a fresh start. Neil was 7. By all accounts, Neil was a lovable kid. He liked sports, and in fact, he was an accomplished wrestler who had won a bantamweight provincial title. He had a quick smile and an infectious energy. He also had a difficult adolescence. Trouble with the law, stints in group homes, the kinds of struggles that are depressingly common among Indigenous youth, navigating a system that was not built for them and often actively worked against them. By the fall of 1990, 17-year-old Neil was living in Saskatoon, placed in a group home in the west end of the city, following a minor conviction for breaking and entering. He was not involved in violent crimes or gangs, and on Saturday, November 24th, he visited his mother, promised he would return to the group home, and went out to see friends near the Snowberry Downs apartment complex. That evening, Neil was with his friend Jason Roy, who was 16. The two had been drinking. They had consumed most of a large bottle of vodka between the two of them. And at some point during the night, their paths crossed with the Saskatoon police. What happened next still remains disputed and obscured. Here are things that we do know. The temperature that night plummeted to a negative 28.1 degrees Celsius, roughly 18 below 0 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, stop with the Celsius, please, sir.
I'm doing this for our international listeners. You would expect me to keep Rebecca from hearing her native measurement for temperature.
It's the one thing where when in Rome, I am not doing as the Romans are doing.
You're doing as the Americans do.
I can't. It doesn't make sense to me. And it's... Fahrenheit is so much more nuanced, which makes more sense in a place that doesn't have much variation in its temperatures.
That number is critical. At that temperature, exposed flesh can develop frostbite in minutes. A person dressed in light clothing, disoriented, miles from a shelter, doesn't have hours. They may not even have a singular hour. According to Jason Roy's initial statement to police, given 5 days after Neil's disappearance, he and Neil had simply parted ways around 11:30 p.m. Roy said he blacked out and didn't remember anything else, and that was the official version for 10 years. But in 2000, Roy told a different story. He said the last time he saw Neil Stonechild alive, Neil was in the back seat of a Saskatoon police cruiser on Confederation Drive. Neil's face was covered in blood, he was handcuffed, and the last words Jason Roy heard him say was, "Jay, help me. They're going to kill me." Roy said that he had given the officers a false name, Tracy Lee Horse, when they questioned him. Electronic records later confirmed this account. At 11:56 p.m. on November 24th, 1990, Constable Brad Singer ran a query on the Canadian Police Information Center database for the names Tracy Horse and Tracy Lee Horse. 3 minutes later, at 11:59 p.m., Singer ran a query for the name Neil Stonechild. 5 minutes after that, at 12:04 a.m. on November 25th, Constable Larry Hartwig conducted a query for the name Bruce Zene, who was known to be Stonechild's cousin. Zene himself would later testify at the riot inquiry that when Hartwig and Singer questioned him, there had been nobody in the back of the cruiser. These 3 time-stamped queries, spanning a window of just 8 months, place both officers in direct contact with Stonechild, Roy, and Stonechild's extended network at the precise time that Neil was last seen alive. Neither Hartwig nor Singer recorded any contact with Neil Stonechild in their official logbooks. This wasn't an administrative oversight. It was an actual concealment of custody. 5 days later, on November 29th, what's 29th? Stupid. 5 days later, on November 29th, 2 construction workers walking along the northwestern periphery of Saskatoon, beyond 57th Street, came across the body of a young man lying face down in a remote, undeveloped industrial field. He was partially clothed, wearing his older brother Dean Lindgren's high school letterman jacket, which offered minimal insulation. One shoe was missing, and his body was frozen solid. The pathologist's report would note that the entire body was frozen firm, and that they were unable to straighten the flexed arm, and that the knees were slightly flexed. The body was identified as Neil Stonechild. Beyond the evidence of profound hypothermia, his body exhibited physical trauma that suggested some kind of violent altercation and mechanical restraint prior to his death. His face... Go ahead.
I don't know. I have a question, but you're not going to know the answer unless it came up in this case. I'm more likely to know the answer to this than you are, but does being frozen prevent
evidence decay?
No.
Oh, no.
Rigor mortis from rigor mortis, girl.
Rigor mortis.
Rigor mortis from, like, does it delay? Do you have to be at a certain temperature for rigor mortis to set in?
That I don't know. That I'm unsure of.
Because I imagine being, if not, then it would be impossible to manipulate the limbs or the position that he was in if we're dealing with him being frozen and if rigor mortis is set in.
I'm not sure. His face did show abrasions, bruising, and cuts. And most critically, the autopsy revealed that his wrist had those parallel linear indentation that are consistent with the application of police handcuffs. Kind of oddly, his nose had similar marks on it. Despite these glaring forensic realities, a teenager found frozen in a remote field, missing a shoe, facial injury, handcuff marks on his wrists. The initial investigation conducted by the Saskatoon Police Service was astonishingly brief and profoundly negligent. It was led by a sergeant named Keith Jarvis, and the official investigation was closed within 3 days. The determination, no foul play. Probable hypothermia, exacerbated by alcohol consumption. Jarvis noted in his report that unless something concrete by way of evidence to the contrary was obtained, it was felt that the deceased had simply died from exposure and froze to death. Saskatoon Police, Sergeant Keith Davis. I love that they just have essentially said, you know what? He froze to death. He was out in the elements. Forget all of this other evidence that we see plainly in front of us.
We've got a 3-day system and close rate on these cases.
Yeah. And then they put the responsibility back on Neil Stonechild's family to try and demonstrate that something criminal had happened. They made no efforts to understand or explain how Neil Stonechild came to be there. No kind of effort to help the family understand how that happened. And what it brings to the surface for me is kind of this institutional reflex. And it goes back to the phrase, and please know this is not me endorsing the phrase, right? But I remember back during Black Lives Matter, we had the phrase ACAB, all cops are bastards. And it's this institutional reflex, right? We do whatever we can to protect ours and be damned with the marginalized. And so here, again, we're seeing the literal victim be criminalized and assume that his death was at his own hands. And it brings up these really frustrating themes. I think that we've already talked about it in this episode, but staggering colonialism. So Stella Bignell did press for answers for years. However, she went largely ignored. A native member of the police force who had been involved in the initial investigation was pulled off the case and told to stop asking questions or that he would lose his job.
Standard operating procedure to me.
Yeah, frustratingly so. So, Starlight Tours became somewhat of an open secret, especially within the Indigenous communities of Saskatoon. Families knew, elders knew, the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations received complaints. Indigenous organizations and activists repeatedly demanded a public inquiry. And the Saskatoon Police Service's official position, which it maintained for decades, was that Starlight Tours were a myth, an urban legend, a story with no basis in reality, except within the police department itself. The practice was more than just known. It was, at least in some corners, treated as a joke. In 1997, 7 years after Neil Stonechild's death, a Saskatoon police constable named Brian Traynor published a humor column in the Saskatoon Sun newspaper. The column was presented as fiction, a ride-along account of 2 fictional officers he called Hawk and Gumby. In one installment, the 2 characters pick up an intoxicated man outside the Salvation Army. They decide to take him for a drive. The car comes to an abrupt stop in front of Queen Elizabeth Power Station. The fictional officer yells for the man to get out. The man scrambles into the thickets along the riverbank and disappears. The column ends with the line, "One less guest for breakfast." A working police officer for the Saskatoon Police Service wrote that in a city newspaper, describing in what can only be thought of as barely veiled fictional terms, the exact practice that the department publicly denied.
I would say that's about as funny as some of my jokes.
It's not quite landing, is it? Mm-hmm. I don't feel overly humored by his comedic sensibilities.
You should start a podcast.
It included the exact location where 3 years later, frozen bodies would be found. The Saskatoon Star Phoenix would later cite this column as evidence that the department was fully aware of what was happening. It is difficult to read it as anything other than a confession dressed as comedy.
I was going to say just aware.
Yeah.
It's more than aware.
It was an insider's wink to the audience, right? It was a wink to those who were in on the joke. And the ones who weren't in on the joke were being left on the sides of fields. Scholar Shireen Rozak would later observe that the very existence of a popular name for the practice was testimony to how common it was. You do not name something that happens once. The Starlight Tours had multiple names across multiple cities. In some parts of Western Canada, it was called a midnight ride. The term itself had entered the vernacular. It was police jargon before it was public knowledge. Meanwhile, the broader public remained largely unaware. Non-Indigenous Saskatoon either had not heard the stories or had chosen not to believe them. The practice existed in a kind of institutional shadow, visible to those who were its targets, but invisible to those who were not. This is the landscape as it existed heading into the winter of 2000, a practice that was at least 24 years old, multiple victims, and likely far more than the documented cases. A police department in active denial, and a community that knew the truth, but lacked the evidence needed to force the rest of the city and the country to listen.
I want to talk, I guess, a little bit about how you said that the people who were being targeted were aware of it, but the people who were not being targeted were not aware of it. That is, in most cases, the best way to explain privilege. And I had a conversation once with my dad, who is a cis-het white man.
A local podcast.
And I said something about him having privilege. And because he is quadriplegic, he couldn't see that he would be privileged because he's quadriplegic. And I was like, right, but privilege, it almost exists in a kind of vacuum, depending on the circumstance, right? Like, there are situations in which I would have privilege that you wouldn't have. They're fewer and further between, but it depends entirely on the context. But if we're talking about just general greater society in Texas, in the US, in Canada, in the UK, it's if you are white, if you are male, if you are hetero, cisgender, average height, able-bodied even, because that is part of it, right? Like, there are places within which
we have privilege.
You were making noise. I was waiting for you to stop.
Oh, sorry.
There are places that because he is not able-bodied, yes, he does not have privilege, but the majority, generally speaking, he does carry a lot of privilege. I carry quite a bit of privilege. You carry quite a bit of privilege. A lot of it does boil down to our skin color, doesn't it? Political podcast.
It's a balance. It's a scale, right? We have privilege and then we have barriers and disabilities.
Yeah.
And your dad's right. He is a disabled quadriplegic. That adds a lot to his barrier disability scale, right? But he's not suffering because he's a white man. He suffers because he's disabled, and we treat disabled people poorly in this country. And so it's hard to reconcile the idea that you still have white male cisgender privilege, but you also have this kind of factor that adds as a counterbalance. I think that's true for a lot of individuals. There are a lot of white people who have white privilege, right? But they think because they have these other mitigating factors that make their life worse.
Not according to though.
That doesn't surprise me. They have these mitigating factors that reduce their accessibility, that reduce their ability to move forward in life, to move up in life. That could be educational discrimination. That could be gender or sexuality discrimination. That could be intellectual discrimination. It can be a whole host of things. Socioeconomic discrimination. But the truth is you're not suffering because you're white. You have advantages because you're white. I don't want to get into the whole of privilege, right? Like, that is such a complicated and nuanced conversation.
Right.
But our privilege isn't negated by the disabling factors or barrier factors that exist, right? Or the discriminatory factors that exist. You might be a woman, you still have white privilege. I might be gay, I still have white privilege.
Right.
And I'm welcomed into more rooms than my non-white counterparts are socially.
Yeah, when you said that the people who were being targeted were aware, but the people who were not aware, I'm like, that in a nutshell is privilege, because 90% of the time you don't recognize that you even are carrying that privilege. It's hard to see, but once you do see it, once you're able to like zoom out and look at that and reflect on that, it's important that you know better, do better, and make sure that you're doing your part to do away with that, or to be inclusive when you see people not being included, I suppose.
And this is my bone with networks like Fox News and certain politicians. They have fooled the average white American into believing that their whiteness is their stumbling block, that they are treated poorly because they are white. And it is ludicrous. It is bananas. If we look at the current administration, look at how many underqualified or totally unqualified candidates hold positions in a country in a stance that says we're anti-DEI. Bitch, this is absolutely DEI work. We are giving this, the thing that you were decrying, giving jobs to people who are lesser able because of their skin color, race, or ethnicity, is exactly what you're doing. And we have made white people, I say we, people have made other white people believe that their whiteness isn't a privilege, that it is their discriminatory factor. And it's so crazy that we can fool the majority, the vast racial majority, into believing that they're being discriminated against because of their race. Again, not a political podcast, but that's the internal mechanism that drives this conversation, that drives distrust, that drives a society that treats others poorly. They misdirect their frustration so the rich can continue to build a subservient class. You are not mad at your Mexican immigrant neighbor. You're not mad at your black neighbor for stealing your wages. You're mad that you're not getting paid appropriately, and you've been fooled into thinking that they're the villains, that they're the ones that are keeping you from living the kind of life that you want to live. And in truth, we don't seize the means of production. We're not treated fairly. The proletariat is treated like shit. We are underpaid, undervalued, given destitution for benefits. Do your best to make health insurance work for you. You are not mad at your neighbors that are enduring the same or worse treatment. You should be mad at the people who are putting you in this position to begin with.
It's magic, right? Misdirection. It's just misdirection, isn't it?
So there you go. Sorry,
Wow.
random YouTube viewer.
Why did you take us there?
Well, if I'm being honest, I think you took us there, and I just had to keep going. Yep.
No, it wasn't me.
Yes.
Couldn't have been. It would never be me.
The cascade of events that finally... I was just happy doing true crime. I was just happy telling my little... I was just happy doing my little story. And then you said, my dad and his white privilege. And that got me all fucked up. Because I know who your dad's really mad at, but he doesn't.
Right.
Okay.
And then you said Fox News.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. I don't know if any of that makes the final cut, but, you know. The cascade of events that finally exposed the Starlight Tours unfolded across a span of just over 2 weeks in January and February of 2000. The speed and density of what happened during this period is kind of staggering. There's a concentration of death and near death that reads less like coincidence and more like a system that met its breaking point. On January 19th, 2000, Lloyd Joseph Dusty Horn, a 53-year-old... Don't look at me like that. Don't look at me like that on Dusty Horn. Lloyd Joseph Dusty Horn was a 53-year-old Indigenous man who was found frozen to death outside a Saskatoon apartment building. He had been arrested by police the previous day for public intoxication and was placed in the drunk tank. Despite displaying obvious signs of hallucination and distress, Dusty Horn was released. An officer was asked to drive him home, and the officer complied, but Dusty Horn could not get inside. He was found dead 3 hours later. His jacket, it would later be discovered, was inside a garbage bag he had been carrying, and no one at the police station had inventoried its contents. His death was not a Starlight Tour in the strictest sense, but it demonstrated the same underlying dynamic. An Indigenous man in police custody, released into lethal conditions with no apparent concern for his survival. What happened to Dusty Horn haunted at least one officer, and on February 18th, when the same officer was asked to drive another man home from the drunk tank, he refused, insisting the man be sent in a taxi instead. That man was Darcy Dean Ironchild. He made it home but died hours later from a drug overdose. His brother argued that if police had taken him to the hospital rather than releasing him, he might still be alive.
The guy who was tasked with taking him home, wasn't that after our opening story?
Yes.
Because that was in January 2000.
Mm-hmm. That happened on January 28th, 2000. Okay,
and then February 18th is when this happened?
Yes.
So it wasn't just the fact that this one guy survived then?
No. Sorry, go ahead.
There was an officer who also had a conscience paired with a survivor. I have to imagine that his name was Darrell?
Yes. His name was Darrell Night, and he survived.
I can't imagine that Darrell's the only person to have survived.
Well, and that's kind of where we go next, right? So go ahead.
Sorry, what I was getting at is that it wasn't just that he survived, because I don't think that he's the only person to have survived, but it's that he survived, and there was also at least one person who was working in the capacity of a police officer who was like, this is wrong. This doesn't sit well with me. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not just that this one person survived or that this one person didn't feel right about it, that it's got to be a combination, because it's so systemic that it has to be more than just one flag being raised.
Yes, absolutely. I think that was really important to point out. So thank you. So to kind of contextualize again, 9 days after Dusty Horn's death on January 28th, Darrell Night would have his encounter with Constables Dan Hatchen and Ken Munson. I want to note now that Darrell Night did not come forward immediately. He was frightened. He did not expect that anyone would believe him. Then on the very next day, January 29th, the body of Rodney Nastis was discovered in an industrial area just north of the Queen Elizabeth Power Station. Nastus was 25 years old and a member of the Onion Lake Reserve near Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. He had been released from a Saskatoon detention facility 3 days earlier and had gone out drinking with his brother to celebrate. He was last seen heading downtown with a stranger, apparently on his way to a nightclub. His body was identified by his tattoos, which included dragons, eagles, and skulls, and the cause of his death was hypothermia. He was found in the same desolate stretch of industrial prairie where Night had been abandoned just hours earlier. Less than a week later, on February 3rd, a second body was found belonging to Lawrence Kim Wegner, a 30-year-old social work student at the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. He was discovered frozen in an open field near the city dump and the Queen Elizabeth Power Station. He was wearing only a white t-shirt, jeans, and wool socks. No shoes, no jacket. Wagner had been struggling with mental illness and drug addiction. The evening before his death, he had been using drugs in a West End apartment before staggering outside and causing a disturbance. A woman called the police, and an eyewitness, who saw Wagner's face clearly, later testified at the coroner's inquest that she watched officers push Wagner headfirst into the backseat of a cruiser, and that was the last sighting of Lawrence Wagner alive. His mother, Mary Wagner, would later retrace her son's final steps on a night just as cold. She wore a t-shirt and jeans, no boots, trying to understand what it would have been like. She said, "How can anybody survive with a t-shirt and socks?" The geographical clustering of these bodies around the same power station where Darrell Night had sought refuge was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. It pointed to a localized, preferred drop-off point, or, in more practical terms, a kill zone. 4 Indigenous men dead in 6 weeks. 1 survivor, all connected to the Saskatoon Police Service. And in early February, Darrell Night made the decision that would change everything. Darrell Night did not go to the media first. He went to a police officer. And in early February 2000, Night approached a member of the Saskatoon Police Service whom he felt he could trust and told him what happened on the night of January 28th. The officer listened and agreed to pursue the case. Night brought his uncle with him, and he told his whole story. And then later, as he recalled, it was headlines all over the city and Canada. The timing of Night's disclosure ended up being seismic. He came 4 days after the discoveries of Nastus and Wegner's frozen bodies in the same area where he had been abandoned. Lawrence Joseph of the Federation of the Saskatchewan Indian Nations captured the public mood, calling the police conduct nothing short of blatant abuse of authority and abuse of power, and noting that anyone who left a dog outside like that would have been charged with the crime. The Saskatoon Police Service initial response was to deny any connection between Knight's allegation and the frozen bodies. Police Chief Dave Scott said he had no reason to link the deaths with the complaint against his officers. But the outcry was overwhelming. Indigenous organizations, the Saskatchewan Coalition Against Racism, and the FSIN all demanded independent investigation. By the end of the week, Chief Scott reversed course and asked the Provincial Ministry of Justice to bring in the RCMP, our Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Apologies, I got that wrong earlier.
What did you say?
I said CRMP.
Oh.
I put Canadian Royal Mounted Police, not Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is, I think, what you just said.
RCMP. Yeah. On February 16th, Saskatchewan's Ministry of Justice formally asked the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to launch the criminal investigation. The RCMP assembled a task force of 15 investigators, plus support staff, and designated the investigation Project Ferric. Within weeks, the mandate expanded to include the deaths of Dusty Horn and Ironchild. And then came the connection that tied the present to the past. On February 22nd, the Saskatoon... Do you see how fast all of this is unfurling? It's crazy to me that we had January with these 4 Indigenous deaths and one survivor. And then come the end of February, we're already seeing major headway. The Saskatoon Star Phoenix published an article by reporter Leslie Perot that drew a direct line between Knight's account. What?
Well, you asked me a question, and as I stopped to think to speak, you then just headed straight on. Also, you were very animated, so you're doing things to the sound, and I'm like, okay.
I just get so excited when good things happen.
Yeah, so this is a big thing, right? This is
Huge.
major. This is corruption within our protect and serve people. This is it's big, and so when it's finally presented at a time by people who know that it's who not just know that it's wrong, but like acknowledge that it's wrong. These things do happen really fast when they're this big because it's terrible when you actually expose it to the public what was going on. So it doesn't really surprise me that once it got out there fast. The worst news travels the fastest, I think. So it doesn't really surprise me, but it did have to be done at a certain point in time, even if it was decades after it should have been.
Well, I guess you're right. You know, I almost think of like dominoes that are set up to fall. Mm-hmm. And I just think about all of the potential energy that finally makes it to the last domino, mm-hmm. and how it usually goes whoosh, because all of the potential kinetic energy that's been built up, and there is no place else for it to go. On February 22nd, the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix published an article by reporter Leslie Perot that drew a direct line between Knight's account and the decade-old death of Neil Stonechild. Stella Bignell, Neil's mother, spoke publicly about her son's death and the investigation she had always believed was a sham. And again, we know the parallels were undeniable. The RCMP added Stonechild's case to Project Ferric 13 years after his death, 10 years after the police had closed the file in 3 days. The Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations set up a justice hotline, and within days, approximately 100 complaints of police harassment and abuse poured in from Indigenous people across the province. The Starlight Tours were no longer an open secret, they were a national scandal.
Yeah, that was the other thing that I thought after I stopped talking, was the people who were being targeted were aware of it. And so once you get the greater public who are unable to ignore it or who are recognizing what's going on, then you get to come forward and say, yes, this is going on. Here's my story, which then further supports this and helps it get out there faster, bigger, harder, stronger.
Like a snowball rolling down a hill.
Yes. Like a snowball in negative 21.8 degrees Celsius.
Okay, we didn't have to go all there. Darrell Night ultimately paid a high personal price for coming forward. He received death threats. He described the experience as deeply traumatic and isolating. His brother Merv later recalled that Darrell was a bricklayer by trade, and he loved sports, football, track, and field, and was proud of the school buildings he had helped construct on the First Nation land across Saskatchewan and Alberta. He was not an activist by nature. He was a working man who had been kidnapped by police and had the courage to say so. University of Alberta professor Tasha Hubbard, who featured Knight in her 2004 National Film Board documentary, Two Worlds Colliding, said that Knight understood he was not just speaking for himself. He felt deep empathy for the men who had died and believed it was his responsibility to come forward on their behalf. The documentary won the Canada Award. Knight's survival and his willingness to testify became the fulcrum on which the entire case turned. We're kind of heading into the reckoning now. And so the legal and institutional aftermath of the Starlight Tours scandal unfolded in stages, each revealing a different layer of failure. The results were, depending on your vantage point, either a partial vindication or a devastating indictment of how seriously Canada takes the lives of its Indigenous citizens. Constables Dan Hatchin and Ken Munson, the officers who had driven Darrell Night to the outskirts of Saskatoon, were charged with assault and unlawful confinement. Their defense was that Knight had asked to be dropped off. They claimed he said something along the lines of, "Look, boys, drop me off anywhere, just don't take me in and charge me." The prosecution countered that regardless of what Knight may have said, the officers had a legal duty to either take him to the station or ensure his safety, and that abandoning a man in sub-zero temperatures, miles from shelter, was by any definition unlawful confinement. In September 2001, a jury agreed. Both officers... Yeah, right? Like, no shit.
But he said to just drop him off anywhere, just to not take him in and charge him. So we did what we were supposed to do. We did what he asked. I'm sorry. Why did you have him in your vehicle in the first place? Was it because he was drunk? Was it because there was alcohol in his system, making freezing temperatures even more dangerous for him because of the thinning of his blood?
That's a really weird defense. Right?
Yeah.
Both officers were convicted. They were sentenced to 8 months in prison. The maximum sentence was
8 months. I get it. It was just the one, but it wasn't just the one. These people are murderers. They're homicidal maniacs. 8 months for just the one assault is...
But do you remember when I did the monster of Miramichi and the highest sentence they could give him was 25 years? And I think that we looked it up, and in Canada, even people who murder are like given 25 years, and at 25 years they have to be eligible for parole.
I remember looking that up for the Deliana Hang case.
Maybe it was Deliana Hang.
We mentioned that case a lot. I mentioned that case a lot.
I was about to say... But, you know, it's like how we've talked about before. God, there's a lot of ways. Sometimes I don't necessarily like being... God, that sounds terrible. There's no way around it. America gets some things right, and I think putting away murderers for life is one of them. So they were sentenced to 8 months in prison. Maximum sentence was 10 years. Neither was charged with attempted murder, and they both roughly served 4 months before being released. However...
You said neither was charged with attempted murderer, which is so funny because when you say murderer, when you're using that word, when you mean to use murderer, it sounds like you just say murder. So now I'm questioning if you know the difference between murder and murderer. Or if you've just got them backwards this whole time and I've chalked it up to...
I do know the difference. And I think it's for one reason. Do you remember the Rihanna song, Unfaithful? And she says, I don't want to be a murderer. Yes.
Familiar, yes.
You know, I just be dropping the end sounds off of words, which is a critique I've gotten before, that I even got as a debater so long ago. But let me take it again.
There's no point. I'm not taking any of this out.
Neither was charged with attempted murder. They served roughly 4 months before being released. However, both were fired from the Saskatoon Police Service and lost their pensions.
You sounded like Alan Cumming that time.
How did I sound like Alan Cumming? Okay.
You'll hear it.
This remains the first and only instance in which Saskatoon police officers have been criminally convicted and sent to prison for their direct participation in a Starlight Tour.
Because he didn't die?
I guess so. For the Nastis and Wegner families, the outcomes were far less definitive. The RCMP's Project Ferret investigation into both deaths was declared inconclusive. Coroner's inquests were held, and in both cases, juries determined the men had died of hypothermia, but they could not, or would not, make a conclusive determination about how they ended up where they were found. Ultimately, no criminal charges were ever filed. Lawrence Wegner's mother would later say that when they found her son's body, the police never treated it like a homicide. A police sergeant admitted the crime scene had been contaminated by an investigator's own footprints, blaming it on curiosity and a lack of training. The recommendation for both inquests focused on police policy reform and Indigenous police relations. No officer was ever held accountable for either death. The most extensive proceeding was the Commission of Inquiry into the Death of Neil Stonechild. On February 20th, 2003, the government of Saskatchewan appointed the Honorable Justice David H. Wright to conduct a public inquiry. The mandate was carefully circumscribed. It was authorized to examine the circumstances of Stonechild's death and the adequacy of the original investigation, but it could not assign criminal or civil responsibility. It was not a trial. No one could be convicted. The inquiry began testimony on September 8, 2003, at the Sheraton Cavalier Hotel in Saskatoon. 46 witnesses testified, included 17 current and former members of the Saskatoon Police Service. Jason Roy also told his story, the revised version, the one where Neil was bleeding and handcuffed in the back of the cruiser. Roy's family was ultimately placed in the RCMP Witness Protection Program. That fact alone speaks to the climate of fear surrounding the case. Justice Wright's findings, released on October 26, 2004, more than a year later, were unequivocal. He concluded that Neil Stonechild had been taken into custody by Constables Larry Hartwig and Brad Sanger on the night of November 24, 1990. He determined that the marks on Stonechild's wrist and nose were likely caused by handcuffs. He found the CPIC queries, the 3 timestamp database searches linking both officers to Stonechild, Roy, and Zane within an 8-minute window, had been either overlooked or ignored by the original investigators. Records were also missing. Logbooks had been altered. The original investigation, led by Sergeant Keith Jarvis, was characterized by Justice Wright as superficial and totally inadequate. Wright described the broader dynamic in Saskatchewan as a tale of two solitudes, a profound structural gulf of distrust between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous institutions. The inquiry revealed that for over a decade, the Saskatoon Police Service had systematically rejected or ignored information from the Stonechild family and the media that cast credible doubt on the conduct of the original investigation. Anything to say, or would you like me to keep going?
You mentioned the handcuff marks on the wrist and on the nose. Just think that it's like a defensive thing to put your hands in front of your face if you're being attacked.
Brutalized.
Right. That's really all I can think of with that he would be defending him, not defending himself, but like protecting his face, and that would be what would cause the marks to end up on his nose as well.
Neither Larry Hartwig nor Brad Sanger was ever criminally charged in connection with Neil Stonechild's death. There is some legal dissonance occurring here. The evidence was sufficient to fire 2 officers on the basis that a teenager was in their custody moments before he was found frozen to death with handcuff marks on his wrist, but it was not sufficient. Or perhaps more accurately, no prosecutor was willing to argue that it was sufficient to bring criminal charges before a jury. The failure of the Crown to initiate prosecution for manslaughter or criminal negligence causing death remains one of the most pointed grievances in the history of Indigenous police relations in Canada. The inquiry ultimately issued a recommendation: increase the number of Indigenous police officers, designate an Aboriginal peace officer with rank of sergeant, improve race relations and anger management training, make it easier for the public to file complaints against officers. In 2003, Police Chief Russell Sabo made a public admission that would have been unthinkable years earlier. He acknowledged the practice had happened more than once, and he pointed to the 1976 case. He offered an apology and said it was important to take ownership when something is done wrong. It was the first time any senior member of the department had confirmed what Indigenous communities had been saying for a generation. The story of the Starlight Tours does not end with inquiries and convictions. What followed was something more insidious, an ongoing tension between the impulse to remember and the institutional compulsion to forget. Between 2012 and 2016, someone inside the Saskatoon Police Service repeatedly deleted the section about Starlight Tours from the department's Wikipedia page. A University of Saskatchewan student named Addison Herman first noticed the deletions. An internal investigation confirmed that at least 2 of the edits had originated from a computer within the police department. A spokesperson denied the deletions were officially sanctioned, saying investigators could not determine who had done it. She added that the department was focused on moving forward. The Saskatoon Star-Phoenix confirmed the story in March 2016, and all the mayor of Saskatoon had to say was that he was very disappointed.
That's a very American approach to be like, oh, this bad thing happened. Let's pretend it didn't happen. Let's
sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, and when I say American, I mean the Americas.
North American.
The North America, yeah. Because one of the things that I've found here is that it's like, yeah, that happened. Not great, but let's not forget what our country, what our leaders back then did and why it was wrong and not. No, I mean...
The British could forget. What is it, like 200 countries across the world celebrate their independence from Britain? It's some outlandish number.
You live and you learn.
Well, and that really is the point. You live and you learn, which means that you have to know the history. Really and truly, these deletions in and of themselves, I guess, aren't huge, but they're emblematic of, again, that institutional reflex to protect and deny. Just like the Indigenous bodies were physically removed from the city's visible landscape and abandoned in the darkness, the margin of Saskatoon, so is this information, so is the history, the record of the disappearances. In 2018, an Indigenous man named Ken Thomas alleged that he had been picked up by 2 Saskatoon police service officers and dropped off outside city limits at night in the cold. The Public Complaints Commission investigated and stated the allegation was unfounded, citing video and audio recordings from police vehicles. By 2018, the Saskatoon Police Service had dash cameras and recording equipment that would have been unthinkable in 1990 or 2000. Whether the technology alone is sufficient to prevent the practice is a question that remains unanswered. Then, in 2022, the Saskatchewan provincial government chose not to include the Starlight Tours in the province's school curriculum. Indigenous advocates described the decision as an internal pattern of erasure, colonial violence perpetuated through silence. The refusal to teach the history to the next generation.
That was no taxation without representation.
I know.
Was
not
that
to pat
yours?
myself on the back.
Yeah.
Yes. The refusal to teach this history to the next generation ensures that the institutional shadow in which the Starlight Tours thrived is preserved. Darrell Night, the man whose survival cracked the whole thing open, moved to British Columbia after the trials and never returned to Saskatoon. And good for you, Darrell. He told Maclean's magazine that he found it impossible to recover from what had been done to him while remaining in the city where it happened. He continued to suffer hearing loss and communication difficulties as a result of the trauma from the incident. Darrell Night never received an apology from the police. On April 2nd, 2023, Darrell Night died at the age of 56. A wake and a funeral were held at the Saulteaux First Nation, roughly 150 kilometers northwest of Saskatoon. His brother Merv said Darrell did not want to be defined by one evening in his life, that he was, above everything, a generous and warm person who would give out whatever he had in his pocket to help someone else. His former lawyer, Donald Worm, the Cree attorney who had been instrumental in the legal proceedings, said there was no question that Darrell Night had made a difference. He called Night's name synonymous with pushback against police misconduct in the city of Saskatoon. Professor Tasha Hubbard called his legacy one of exceptional courage. Of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, 18 deal specifically with the criminal justice system. Call to Action 38 urges all levels of government to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in custody. Call to Action 39 calls for a national plan to collect and publish data on the criminal victimization of Indigenous people. Saskatchewan remains one of the last provinces in Canada to adopt independent civilian oversight of its police forces.
The phrase 1350?
No.
So we are having this last week, we had like a little training. We've got little trainings that happen twice a week. So we had a training the other day. 1350. So he's going through this thing and he's like, so some of these are American. So 1350 is apparently something that's discriminatory. And it's because 13% of America is Black, but 50% of American prisons are Black.
They ate with that.
Did they?
I really, up until right now, didn't know where this was all going back to. And then you finally brought it back to 1350, and I was like, okay, this digression makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah.
There might have been a little burying of the lead.
How dare.
How dare.
It wasn't that I buried it. You were with me when I forgot it in real time.
That's true. Anyways.
By
that's
lead,
my
you
case.
mean... Okay, all right. That's what we're doing right now. I see.
Sorry.
Let's see. All right.
So you're going to have a lot to cut out, so I just wanted to put, and that's my case.
I think that you shared this gross mistreatment, discriminatory, hateful case well. You told it well. I appreciate that you told me this. But I don't know that I have anything like conclusive to add to it because I felt like every time I had a thought, I just let it fall out of my face in real time. So all of that to say, you told it well. I'm glad that you shared this. I'm glad that this thing that Rebecca requested over a year ago.
Over a year ago?
Over a year ago.
It was a hard case to do. It really was.
Because I remember talking about it when I was in my house in San Antonio. And we're like 3 days shy of it being a year since I had my interview.
Wow.
So hopefully it was timely enough for Rebecca.
She really held in there with us. I told her we were covering it for this week and she seemed excited.
Did she say she still listens or that she would turn us back on for this week?
I think that our number one original fan is still listening.
No.
And I wanted to do it right and I wanted to do it well. I wanted it to be honest. When I tried before, it just felt convoluted. I had a hard time picking a focus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that was because I felt like I had to give every victim equal consideration in the storytelling, and I couldn't figure out how to do that. And then finally deciding to kind of put everything around Darrell Night because his account had so much sway in how things unfurled.
Yeah.
That gave me a lot of clarity. That gave me the ability to look at the case with a perspective. And so I hope that it came across respectfully. I hope that it came across in a way that shares the true history of Saskatoon and sheds light on some of the terrors that the Indigenous communities of the Saskatchewan province have faced.
I mean, I think so, but also, what was your little phrase that you taught me last week?
Did I taught you last week?
Yeah, but I'm just some bitch.
Oh.
But what do I know? I'm just some bitch.
And that's not even mine. That's just from a TikToker that I'm obsessed with.
Yeah. Well, Rebecca, let us know. Did Hayden do it justice?
Rebecca, did I nail it? That's all we've got for this episode. Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.
If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review. Preferably one that's positive and hip-hoppin' and brings all the listeners to the yard.
Yeah, if this is not for you, just move along. You don't need to rate or review us. And if you
comment on our YouTube episodes.
No, I find that comical. But if you are liking, it's better for you to leave a review to let others know what it is that you do like about it, so that if it's not for them, they know not to waste their time. But if it is, they can come join us. In addition, a complete list of sources can be found in the episode description.
And we know that for sure because I already sent them to Cameron in an email just moments ago. Recommend us.
He did. The last episode that he told me a case for still doesn't have them, but that's fine.
Recommend us to a friend, and if you are able and willing to help us produce this podcast, sign up for our Patreon.
You're Richie Rich.
Dollar bills.
The link to joining our supportive bestie tier for only $2 a month is listed in the show notes. Make sure that you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram if we haven't driven that home enough yet.
And again, email us. Email us your guest request. Email us your story request at endofcrimepod@gmail.com. You can reach out with questions, suggestions. Also, if you want to send something to me individually, feel free to find me on Instagram. I'll gladly message back and forth with you. Shout out Rebecca. Also, shout out again to my good buddy who I work with, who constantly is giving me positive feedback. If he has any critiques, he hasn't shared them with me yet. So thank you, Rowan.
Definitely send episode suggestions. I think that I'm finding that that's the most taxing part of this lately, is trying to find a case to cover. And I try to be respectful of people who have suggested things in comments or in DMs. But sometimes the case that you're suggesting, Hayden loves to be very loud when I'm talking because of the patriarchy. Sometimes the case that you're suggesting does not have enough information for it to be a case that is covered in an episode on a pod. So
if you have a favorite case, one that you're like really familiar with that you just want us to cover, be a darling dear and maybe point us in the right direction, because like Cameron said, sometimes finding information is really hard. And we do try to make sure that our stories possess a high level of veracity. We want it to be honest. We want it to be real. We don't want to tell you what to think. And so any kind of help in that way can also be a good starting block.